Hello, my name is Liz Feld, and I'm a museum educator at the Peel Art Gallery Museum and Archives. I have a master's in museum studies from Harvard University, and I'm currently pursuing a PhD at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. I am so pleased to be presenting to you today, although sadly not in person. In 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, also known as UNDRIP, outlining the minimum human rights standards required for Indigenous populations to live in dignity. Over 2 decades in the making, this document addresses 370 million Indigenous peoples around the world, including a population of over 1.5 million dwelling in Canada. The same year, the United Nations Human Rights Council established the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as EMRIP, originally drafted to provide advice to the Council on UNDRIP, but it was amended in 2016 to identify, disseminate, and promote good practices and lessons learned regarding efforts to achieve the ends. Recognizing the significance of repatriation for Indigenous peoples, the UNHRC introduced Resolution 4219 in 2019 to provide a framework to facilitate the international repatriation of Indigenous peoples' sacred items and human remains through the continued engagement of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Expert Mechanism, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, States, Indigenous Peoples, and all the other relevant parties in accordance with their mandates. NRIP recommends the creation of partnerships between state governments and Indigenous peoples to organize the return of these items to Indigenous territories in accordance with laws, customs, and traditions. The inclusion of museums, universities, and other collecting institutions in these partnerships will ensure the adherence to UNDRIP Articles 11, 12, and 31, all of which directly engage with repatriation and will strengthen the development of deeper and more trusting relationships that incorporate indigenous knowledge, protocols, traditional laws, and customs regarding collections. The Canadian federal government originally rejected UNDRIP along with 3 other nations over concerns of wording pertaining to potential land rights claims. In 2008, the Canadian government formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and released its final report in 2015. 4 TRC recommendations, numbers 67 to 70, directly relate to Canadian museums and archives, with number 67 calling on the federal government to fund a Canadian Museums Association CMA study of museum policies and best practices, and for the government to establish a funding program to further projects related to reconciliation. During spring of 2020, the CMA announced an impending report that will be released in the fall of 2021, so hopefully soon, identifying key issues and producing recommendations for the inclusion and representation of Indigenous communities within museums and cultural centers. Without a national strategy or framework to guide museums, individual institutions like the National Gallery of Canada, which introduced Indigenous influence branding in August 2021, are assessing their place within Canadian culture and examining how they have historically served and or underserved the nation's population. The devastating and ongoing location of mass graves during the summer of 2021 on the sites of former residential schools should settle any question or challenge to the systemic oppression and cultural genocide inflicted on Canada's Indigenous peoples. The repatriation of Indigenous sacred objects and human remains is essential towards furthering TRC recommendations. As commissioners note, words of apology alone are insufficient. Concrete actions are both symbolic and material. Museums are of particular importance because they serve multiple functions, can reach wide demographics, and are viewed as respected authorities. In a 2015 UNESCO report notes that museums are key spaces of education, inspiration, and dialogue, holding up a mirror to society, introducing visitors to alternative visions of the world. They provide opportunities to foster creativity, imagination, and respect for self and others. The seizure of sacred Indigenous artifacts and human remains, many of which are currently housed in Canadian and international museums, leaves a deep void in Indigenous communities, thereby hindering and healing impending efforts towards reconciliation. There are a number of examples of repatriation attempts and successes initiated by both Indigenous peoples and museums, but obstacles at every turn are making attempts at repatriation and even reconciliation challenging. In a 2020 Yellowhead Institute report, which is a First Nations-led research center, the report on reconciliation progress found that no museums have encompassed under the CMA have released reports or statements regarding how their institutions have ensured compliance with recommendations. With many Canadian museums initiating paths to decolonization, it is important to distinguish museum efforts towards reconciliation from decolonization, since in post-colonial writing, the terms are often used in similar contexts, yet have very different meanings and implications. Educators Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang explain that decolonization requires the complete elimination of settler property rights and settler sovereignty. It requires the abolition of land as property and upholds the sovereignty of native land and people. Canada is a settler colonial state, and since the land is the settler's most valuable asset as a home and as a source of income, the authors explain that the violence that ensues becomes an ongoing structure with the intent of destroying the Indigenous relationship to the land through oppressive policies and the erasure of history and culture. The questionable ethics behind the residence of Indigenous sacred objects and human remains in museum storage facilities around the globe continues to be an ongoing concern and precludes the healing and agency of Indigenous populations. Marginalizing historical accounts emphasizing the settler experience fail to reflect Indigenous history and experiences. Colonial frameworks were established primarily during 16th and 17th century, during the 16th to 19th century, when newly wealthy European elites and settlers became collectors, and scientific interest in Indigenous populations was growing. During this period, this new model of science became the measure of all human truth and emphasized objective, value-free, and impartial study. The frameworks that guided these principles systematized knowledge, and the outcome produced a limited perspective. Of particular scientific research interests were human skulls and skeletons, with research condoning the exhumation of graves, removal of bodies from battlefields, the theft of bodies from mortuaries, graves, burial caves, and other mortuary sites. Once removed from Indigenous peoples, cultural objects and human remains were transferred to museums, universities, and private collections, displayed as art or artifacts, and studied as specimens. As recently as 1976, members of the Union of Ontario Indians placed an archaeologist from the Royal Ontario Museum under citizen's arrest for looting a graveyard in contravention of the Ontario Cemeteries Act and for indignity to human remains. The looting of sacred objects and human remains left a deep deep and enduring damage on Canada's Indigenous population, including a loss of dignity, difficulty carrying out spiritual practices without necessary artifacts, and the inability to honor cultural obligations to the dead and to ceremonial objects. With museums recognizing their contributions to furthering ongoing Indigenous trauma, ethical considerations with regard to storage, display, representation, and repatriation of Indigenous artifacts have become increasingly critical. Ethical guidelines administered by the International Council of Museums, ICOM, and by national museum organizations like the American Association of Museums and the Canadian Museums Association, with additional protocols being implemented within individual museums. ICOM adopted its latest update to their Code of Ethics in 2006 to ensure no artifacts were illegally obtained, and culturally sensitive materials would only be collected if they could be cared for to the standard and interests of the originating group. In addition to the ICOM Code of Ethics, other guidelines have been formulated by a number of international bodies. For example, UNDRIP, so Article 11, recommends that Indigenous laws governing the use of sacred items must be considered on an equal basis with state laws and other laws governing these items, while Article 12 discusses fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms, and Article 31 addresses Indigenous people's right to maintain, control, protect, and develop cultural heritage. In 1990, the United States adopted the Native Americans Grave Protection and Repatriation Act into federal law, and has led to the repatriation of remains of approximately 79,000 individuals and approximately 2 million items from institutions across the country. The Act establishes a mechanism for the federal government to consult with Native Americans in the repatriation of human remains and ceremonial objects, to notify and consult with affected parties to agree on the process of repatriating human remains and objects, and provides funding to catalog holdings of Indigenous sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, human remains, and funerary objects. For some archaeologists and heritage institutions, these artifacts provide scientific knowledge and are of great value for studying the human past, like migration patterns, cultural practices, diet and health, and should the remains be repatriated and, quote, destroyed, the loss to the pursuit of anthropological knowledge and truth would be tremendous. Critics of scientific research rationale argue that human remains in museum collections and university collections were amassed decades and even centuries ago. Therefore, any research that was going to be performed should already have been completed. Museums are obligated to consider the ethics of retaining remains over demands for repatriation. Indigenous cultures across the globe have been subjected to violent and invasive collecting practices, and though beliefs and rituals vary tremendously, certain common convictions pertaining to honoring the dead prevail across a range of Indigenous peoples. In spite of the continued presence of sacred objects and remains in museum storage facilities, Indigenous peoples have shown an exemplary willingness to pursue reconciliation with museums and other cultural institutions, which often involves revisiting painful histories of colonialism, loss of dignity, forced relocation, military occupation, and loss of lands, territories, and resources. It is necessary for museums seeking reconciliation and better representation to conduct a thorough inventory of their collections, to examine the extent of these holdings, the acquisition history, and the exhibition history of the institution to determine the extent of past colonial engagements. Participating in cooperation with affected parties in this process supports healing with all parties and encourages the formation of more trusting and meaningful relationships. Repatriating human remains and sacred objects is a complicated and highly emotional process. This is a human rights issue. It is the Indigenous peoples of Canada's right to know, as MDRIP says, that their sacred objects and precious artworks are treasured. It is their right to hear their songs and see their dances, and it is their right to know that their ancestors are safe and at peace. Indigenous peoples in Canada believe ownership is a collective right, and it is about community connection and relationship to that artifact. One that cannot be broken by physical transfer or time. But the prohibitive cost of repatriation sometimes compels Indigenous peoples to compromise and consider long-term loans over actual repatriation. Museums, just as any other type of institution or individual, are influenced by external political, social, and fiduciary factors that can obstruct repatriation efforts. Creating and nurturing reciprocal collaborative relationships with Indigenous groups can help to counteract colonizing discourse and restrictive structures. Discovering the provenance of Indigenous objects and remains can be another challenge for museums during the repatriation process, since many Indigenous items and collections were stolen from looted graves and pillaged from homes. Accurate records are often not available. International repatriations are uniquely complex, and challenges may include different legal and policy frameworks at the international, national, and subnational levels, high financial costs, a lack of legal framework or mechanism for the repatriation of ceremonial objects, human remains, and cultural heritage directly to Indigenous peoples involved. The onus is on Indigenous communities to prove ownership claims, and since many museums do not have complete and accurate accessible databases, it is difficult to even track down the location of materials. In 2000, in Canada, the Royal British Columbia Museum has established a strong relationship with the First Nations of the Pacific Northwest of Canada, allowing for a number of repatriations from the museum to Indigenous communities and support for Indigenous repatriation of ceremonial remains and human remains to their rightful places. After receiving a $2 million grant from the provincial government to establish a repatriation program, the museum collaborated with the Haida Gwaii Museum on the Indigenous Repatriation Handbook, which provides policy and technical guidance on repatriation and shares specific experiences of the two museums. Of the approximately 1,400 ancestral remains housed in the Royal BC Museum, about half have been repatriated since 2016, and around 15,000 sacred objects and artworks remain in their care. Canadian Indigenous peoples, like the Grand Council of the Wabanaki Nation, have adopted frameworks for the protection and repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains, including a protocol for the management of human remains and archaeological findings on their territory. Excuse me. In 2015, the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation in Alberta discovered that its sacred belongings were being housed at the Cultural Resources Center of the Smithsonian Institute of the National Museum of the American Indian. These items were taken from their communities in 1926, around the same time that the law was passed in Canada, banning the possession of these objects by Indigenous communities. The theft of these materials led to the loss of 400 ceremonies and stories, resulting in gaps in local knowledge and a sickness in their communities because people lost a part of who they were when they lost these objects. The Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation community took 2 trips to the Smithsonian with the intent of forging a relationship with both the museum and the materials. It was a difficult and emotional journey traveling across the border and having to prove the community's ownership of their ceremonial objects. Calls for repatriation over international borders produce additional challenges. At its 2019 session, MRIP decided to undertake a further study on how the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can be applied to the repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains of Indigenous peoples, currently in the possession of institutions like museums and universities around the world. After being taken in 1929 as per the request of the Swedish consulate, the 19th century Golox totem pole, was taken from the Haisla people of British Columbia and gifted to the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. In 1980, the pole was removed from storage for exhibition, and the Haisla community, after not knowing its whereabouts all this time, were finally able to reclaim it. After 15 long years of negotiations, complicated by the fact that the museum is a state institution and had to obtain permission for its return, and that the Haisla community were obligated to build a storage facility to house and preserve, the pole was finally repatriated in 2006. Ultimately, both parties found the process to be a steep learning curve with a generally positive outcome. The museum was given a replica pole by Haisla artists and have incorporated the repatriation narrative into the pole's exhibition, making for a much richer educational museum experience. The Haisla struggled with tremendous financial burdens to bring home the pole, and though it stands as a reminder of a painful past, it also allows the community to reconnect with their ancestors and their culture. Participating in repatriation work is a healing activity. It necessitates the cooperation and collaboration between the state, the museum, and Indigenous peoples. The historical relationship between museums and Indigenous communities is fraught with violence, oppression, and marginalization. The process of consulting and negotiating between parties builds relationships and creates new understandings and insights, and maybe even new opportunities for critical reflection, engagement, and creative initiatives, ultimately leading towards a more authentic reconciliation. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to further conversation on the discussion board.